Milin stood at the frosted window of her small cabin and looked out at a world that had turned into one endless sheet of white. The Wyoming winter had come hard and cruel, like it had a grudge against anyone who tried to survive. Snow covered the hills, the trees, and the narrow path that led down to town. The wind pushed against the cabin walls and slipped through the cracks in the logs, making the room feel colder than it should. Milin pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did not help much. Cold had found a way into everything. 8 months had passed since the fever took her husband away. Since that day, life had felt like walking through deep snow with no end in sight. Before the winter came, there had been 6 months of drought. The garden Way cared for so carefully had dried up and died. Milin tried to save it, but the sun burned the ground like a hot iron. Now the snow finished what the drought started. The pantry that once held rice, dried fish, and potatoes was empty. The little jars that used to carry hope were now nothing but glass and dust. Milin turned from the window and looked at the table. 4 tin plates sat in a row, placed there the night before like a quiet promise she could not keep. The plates belonged to her children. June, the oldest, tried hard to act grown, even though he was still a boy. Dao was smaller but stubborn, with eyes that noticed everything. Anne stayed quiet most days, as if she was afraid to ask for too much. Little Leanne was the youngest, still believing the world had kindness waiting around the corner. Beside Leanne's plate rested a small wooden doll Way had carved 2 winters ago. The doll's face was worn smooth from small hands that held it through fear and sleep. Milin pressed her palms on the rough table and bowed her head. A heavy shame sat in her chest. She felt like she had failed in every way a mother could fail. She could not keep the crops alive. She could not keep the pantry full. She could not be both mother and father in a land that already looked at her like she did not belong. Folks in town did not say much to her now. They had stopped coming for laundry. They had stopped bringing trade. They had stopped showing their faces, and silence was its own kind of cruelty. On the mantel above the weak fire, the children's stockings hung limp and flat. They had hung them with trembling hands the night before. Their faces were too thin, and their eyes were too big. They had not asked for much, but Milin saw hope hiding behind their smiles. She had promised them nothing, because promises were dangerous when the world could not be trusted. Still, Christmas morning had come, and hope had followed it into the cabin like a stray dog looking for warmth. A creak sounded from the loft above, followed by soft footsteps. Milin did not move. She listened as the children woke, one by one, trying to be quiet, like they knew quiet could protect them. "Mama?" Leanne's voice floated down, sleepy and gentle. "Is it Christmas?" Milin closed her eyes for a moment. Her throat tightened so hard it hurt. She forced her voice to stay steady even though it shook. "Yes, little one, it is Christmas." Above her, June spoke next, older and careful. "Let Mama have a moment," he told the others. He tried to sound brave, like he could hold the roof up with his words. But Milin did not need a moment. She needed a miracle. There was no food. The rice sack was empty. The dried fish was gone. All she had left was hot water and the last of the tea leaves. She thought of boiling tea and calling it breakfast, but the children were not foolish. They would smell the truth the second they came down the ladder. Milin stared at the plates again and felt her heart drop. How did a mother explain Christmas to hungry children? How did she explain that Santa did not visit cabins where the fire was dying and the pantry was bare? She tried to remember prayers from her childhood, words spoken by her elders, back when her world had been full of familiar faces. She tried to remember the prayers the local church people spoke, the ones she heard when she passed the building in town. But nothing came. Only the wind answered, moaning outside like a lonely animal. Then something changed. A sound cut through the storm, faint at first, then clearer. Hooves. Milin lifted her head fast. No one came up this hill. Not since Way died. Not since the town decided the foreign widow was easier to ignore than to help. She moved to the window and wiped away the frost with her sleeve. Her breath fogged the glass again, but she forced herself to look. A wagon was coming up the drifted path. pulled by a large draft horse that moved slow and strong through the snow. A single figure sat on the bench, hunched in a heavy buffalo coat. The horse's breath rose in thick clouds, and the wagon wheels fought through the drifts like they were pushing through a river. Milin blinked hard, sure hunger was playing tricks on her mind. The figure climbed down when the wagon stopped in front of her cabin. It was Arthur Hayes. Everyone in town knew that name. Arthur lived 5 miles east, a rancher who kept mostly to himself. He was a big man, broad as a barn door, with a reputation for silence and solitude. People called him a hermit, a man who preferred cattle over company. Milin had seen him in town a few times, always quiet, always watching, never staying long. Way had spoken to him only once or twice in all the years they lived nearby. Milin's hand trembled as she reached for the door latch. What would a man like Arthur Hayes want on Christmas morning in the middle of a blizzard? Before she could decide, his voice carried through the wind, deep and firm. "Morning. Open up, I need a hand." Milin opened the door slowly. The cold slapped her face, sharp and biting. She stepped onto the porch, her boots crunching in the snow. "Mr. Hayes," she said, confused and wary, "I do not understand." Arthur did not answer her question. He walked to the wagon and pulled at a canvas cover stiff with snow. "Do not need you to understand," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Just need you to help me carry this in before it freezes solid." Milin moved closer, still unsure, still afraid to hope. Then the canvas lifted, and her breath caught like she had been punched. Under the cover sat sacks and bundles, packed tight. A smoked side of beef, potatoes, a bag of white flour, dried apples, a jar of molasses, salt, and a large sack of rice. In the corner was a small paper bag of red candies, like a bright promise in the gray winter light. For a moment, Milin could not speak. The world swayed. Tears blurred her eyes, and she had to grip the porch rail to keep herself steady. "I cannot pay for this," she whispered, her accent thick with fear. "We have no money. I have nothing to give you." Arthur lifted a heavy sack of potatoes onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He looked at her with sharp blue eyes under the brim of his hat. There was no pity in his face, only a kind of plain truth. "Did I ask for payment?" he said. Milin opened her mouth, but no words came. Behind her, the cabin door creaked wider. 4 small faces appeared, wide-eyed and silent. June held Leanne's hand. Dale leaned forward like he could not believe what he was seeing. Anne stayed behind them, quiet but watching. Leanne's voice was the smallest. "Is that food?" she asked, as if speaking too loud might make it disappear. Arthur glanced at the children, then back at Milin. "Your pride is your business," he said, "but letting good food freeze while children go hungry, that is foolish." Milin swallowed hard. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to stand straight. She looked at Jun, then at Dow, then at Anne and Leanne. She saw the hunger in their cheeks and the hope in their eyes. She turned back to Arthur Hayes, the silent rancher who stood in her yard like he had been sent by winter itself. "Jun," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "Dow." "Help, Mr. Hayes." The boys rushed into the snow, and Arthur began handing down the supplies, directing them with calm authority. Milin stepped forward to help, and the first sack she touched felt warm, not from heat, but from the strange feeling of being saved. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned low and the plates still waited on the table, but for the first time in many months, Milin felt something other than fear. She felt the beginning of a change, and she did not yet know what Arthur Hayes had truly come to bring. Arthur did not stop at the door like a man delivering a package. He stepped inside as if he belonged there, filling the small cabin with his sighs and a steady calm that pushed back the panic Milin had been living with. Snow clung to his coat and hat brim. The wind tried to follow him in, but he shut the door with one firm push, and the cabin felt less exposed. Milin stood near the table, still holding the edge like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her mind kept saying it was not real. Food like that did not come to people like her. Not to a widow on a hill the town had forgotten. Not on Christmas morning. Arthur looked at the weak fire and the thin pile of wood near the hearth. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded once, like he had already seen everything he needed to see. He turned and went back out into the storm without waiting for permission. June and Deo came in behind him, carrying sacks that were almost too heavy for them. Their cheeks were red from the cold, but their eyes were bright, alive in a way Milin had not seen in months. Anne hovered at the bottom of the loft ladder, unsure if she should smile, afraid the moment might break. Leanne held the small paper bag of candies with both hands like it was treasure from a story. Arthur returned with a full armload of seasoned oak logs he had brought on the wagon. He dropped them beside the hearth, knelt, and built the fire with quick skill. The flames caught, then grew strong. Heat began to creep back into the room. The frost on the inside of the window started to soften. "Water," Arthur said, looking at June. "Big pot." June blinked, then moved fast, like he had been given an important job. He filled the pot from the barrel and carried it to the stove with both hands. Arthur set it on the grate and poured in a pinch of salt, as if that was the most normal thing in the world. Milin finally found her voice. "Mr. Hayes, I can cook," she said, stepping forward. "You should sit. You have done enough." Arthur glanced at her, then at the children. His face stayed serious, but his voice softened just a little. "We will do it together," he said, faster that way. Quote, Milin did not know why those words made her eyes burn again, maybe because she had not heard anyone say together in a long time. Since Way died, everything had been alone. They worked side by side, and the cabin changed around them. Milin washed rice like it was a sacred thing. The water turned cloudy and white, and she remembered the sound of Way laughing when the children used to beg for second bowls. Arthur showed Deo how to peel potatoes without wasting half the food. His hands were big and rough, but he moved carefully, like he did not want to ruin anything. Anne stood near the table, watching. Milin could see her trying to understand this strange man who came from nowhere with a feast. Milin handed her a cloth and quietly asked her to dry the washed apples. Anne nodded, grateful to be useful. Leanne sat near the fire with her doll, staring at the flames and the candy bag like she was afraid to blink. Soon the air filled with smell. Real smell. Not thin broth or boiled weeds. The beef sizzled in the pan. The potatoes softened in the pot. Rice steamed, and the scent wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. Milin felt dizzy from it. She had forgotten how food could make a home feel alive. Arthur poured coffee from a small tin he had brought, dark and strong. He handed a cup to Milin without asking. "Drink," he said. "You look like you might fall over." Milin took the cup with trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers. The first sip hit her tongue like truth. It was real coffee. Her eyes filled fast. She tried to hold back tears, but they came anyway. Leanne climbed into her lap, small and warm. "Mama," she whispered, "are we having a feast?" Milin held her close and kissed her hair. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "We are having a feast." When the food was ready, they sat at the table like it was a holiday in a rich house instead of a poor cabin on a hill. Arthur did not make a show of it. He simply took the seat at the end and waited as Milin served the children first. That small act broke something inside her. Most men in town would have demanded the first plate. Arthur did not even look at the meat until the children had full bowls. June tried to eat slowly, like he wanted to show manners, but hunger beat manners every time. Dao ate like he was afraid the food would be taken away. Anne took smaller bites, looking up often, like she was checking to see if this was still safe. Leanne chewed her steak with both hands, eyes half closed in pure relief. Milin watched them, and her heart hurt. Their hunger showed her the truth she had been trying not to see. They had been starving. Not just hungry, starving. And she had been cutting her own portion smaller and smaller, thinking that was enough. Arthur ate quietly, but he listened. He listened to Dao talk about a rabbit he nearly caught behind the shed. He listened to Jun explain how he had been checking traps, even when snow blew into his face. Arthur did not laugh at them or brush them off. He nodded like their words mattered, like they were men in training, not poor children in a broken cabin. After the meal, the room felt heavy in a good way, the kind of heavy that came from being full, warm, and safe for the first time in too long. The wind still screamed outside, but inside, the fire roared, and the smell of beef and coffee clung to the walls. Milin began cleaning without thinking, but Arthur stopped her with a small shake of his head. "Let the dishes wait," he said. "Rest a bit." Milin stared at him. Rest was a word she barely remembered. She lowered herself onto the bench and felt her legs tremble from tiredness she had been carrying for months. June looked out the window, then back at Arthur. "The snow is getting worse," he said. "It is not safe to travel." Milin followed his gaze. The storm had thickened into a white wall. The path Arthur had driven up was already filling in again. Even if he wanted to leave, he might not make it back to his ranch. "You can stay," Milin said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Pride tried to rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. "Please, it is dangerous." Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked like a man who did not accept help, even when he gave it. "I can sleep in the barn," he said. "I have furs." Milin stood, steadier now, and shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "You saved our lives. You will sleep by the fire." Arthur hesitated. For a second, Milin thought he might argue again. Then he nodded once, slow, like he had made a decision he did not make often. That night, when the children lay close to the warmth and the storm pounded the roof, Arthur sat in Way's old rocking chair. The chair creaked under his weight. Milin watched him from the table, feeling strange and unsure. The sight of another man in that chair should have hurt, but instead, it felt like the cabin had finally stopped echoing. Leanne padded over in her nightshirt and leaned against Arthur's boot, already half asleep. "Tell a story," she whispered. Arthur looked down at her like he did not know what to do with such a request. He glanced at Milin, almost asking permission without words. Milin nodded gently. Arthur cleared his throat. "I do not know your fairy tales," he said, "but I know the mountains." Quote. The children gathered close, eyes wide again, but this time with excitement, not fear. Arthur began to speak in a low, steady voice. He told them about wolves that moved like shadows through snow. He told them about wild mustangs that could never be tamed. He told them about nights so cold the stars looked sharp enough to cut skin. He spoke about silence in the high country that felt like church. Milin listened, and something inside her eased. She watched Anne's shoulders relax. She watched June's face soften, the weight of being the man of the house slipping off him for a little while. Dao leaned forward, hanging on every word. Leanne fell asleep with her head against Arthur's boot. Arthur's large hand rested gently on Leanne's hair, still and careful, like he understood the value of a small life. Milin looked at the man by her fire and felt a question forming in her chest, heavier than the storm outside. Why had he really come? And why did it feel like Christmas had only just begun? Morning came quiet, but the world outside was still buried. The storm had loosened its grip, yet snowdrifts stood tall as fences, and the path to town was gone again. Sunlight fell weak and pale across the white ground, making everything look clean while hiding how hard it was to move. Arthur was already up before the children. Milin found him outside, brushing snow from the wagon and checking the horse like he was making sure nothing would suffer on his watch. He did not complain about the cold. He moved with the calm of a man who had lived through many winters alone. Inside, the cabin felt different. The fire was strong. The air was warm. The children woke with color in their cheeks. Leanne kept looking into her stocking like she could not believe it was still there. Dao asked if there would be rice again for breakfast. June did not ask for anything. He just watched Arthur with a look that mixed fear, respect, and hope. Arthur stayed that day, then the next. He did not talk about leaving, and Milin did not ask. She did not want to scare the miracle away. Instead, she watched him work like a man who could not stand seeing something broken. He fixed the loose hinge on the door, tightening it so the wind could not slip through as easily. He climbed onto the roof and patched a leak near the chimney where snow had been blowing in. Milin tried to protest, but Arthur only glanced at her and said, "It needs doing." Like that settled it. He brought more wood from the wagon and helped June stack it in a neat wall beside the cabin. He showed June how to swing the axe the right way, so his arms would not tire too fast. He showed Deo how to watch the grain in the log so the blade would split it clean. He did not treat them like small boys. He treated them like hands that mattered. The boys stood taller because of it. Milin cooked what she could with the supplies, careful not to waste a thing. She made rice porridge in the mornings, thick enough to stick to a spoon. She baked simple bread with flour and salt, filling the cabin with a smell that made Anne smile without thinking. She watched Arthur at her table, watched him eat quiet, watched him listen more than he spoke. At night, the children kept asking him for stories. Arthur acted like he did not know why they wanted them, but he told them anyway. He spoke about the high country and the hard lessons the land taught. Milin listened from the corner, sewing a torn shirt, and felt something soft begin to return to her chest. Not joy, not yet, but a kind of safety she had forgotten was possible. By Sunday, the wind had died enough for travel. The path down to town was still rough, but it could be walked. Milin stood at the door in her best clothing, worn but clean, and tied Leanne's scarf under her chin. The children looked nervous, like they knew town meant more than church. Town meant eyes. Town meant whispers. Milin turned to Arthur. "We will go to church," she said, "to give thanks." Arthur's face tightened. He looked away, out at the open snow. "Town folks talk," he said. "Me bringing food is one thing. Walking in with you is another." Milin lifted her chin. Her hands were steady now, even if her heart was not. "Let them talk," she said. "They watched us starve in silence. I am done hiding. You are our friend. If they cannot accept that, it is their sin, not ours." Arthur studied her face for a long moment. Then something changed in him. His mouth pulled into a small smile, and it made him look younger, less like a man made of stone. "All right," he said. "Then we go." The walk was long. Snow crunched under their boots. John carried Leanne when her legs got tired. Arthur carried nothing but his own weight, but it felt like he carried the whole world with the way he walked beside them. He stayed close, not touching, yet always there. When they entered the small wooden church, the room went silent. Heads turned. A woman gasped. The preacher stopped speaking like the words froze on his tongue. Milin felt heat rush to her face, but she kept moving. The children followed, pressed close together. Arthur walked at Milin's side, his face hard and calm, daring anyone to step in their way. They sat near the front in an empty pew. Milin felt eyes on her back like pins. She heard whispers that sounded like snakes in dry grass. She stared ahead and tried to focus on the front of the church, but her hands were cold even in her gloves. The preacher spoke about charity, about helping the stranger, about the heart that God calls good. Milin almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. She had been the stranger in this town for years. The words were for show, not for her. When the service ended, people moved away from them like they carried a sickness. Milin gathered her children and walked toward the door with her head high. Arthur stayed close. Outside, the cold air hit them again, sharp and clean. That was when trouble found them. A group of older boys stood near the steps. One of them, a large boy with a red face, shoved John hard as he passed. John stumbled, trying not to fall in front of everyone. "Look at him," the boys sneered. "Laundry boy and his new daddy." John's face flushed, anger and shame mixing in his eyes. Deo stepped forward, fists clenched, but Milin reached for him, pulling him back. She could already see where this would go. She could already feel fear rising. The boy shoved Yoon again. "Does he pay your mama in beef?" he said, loud enough for others to hear. Before Milin could speak, Arthur moved. He did not shout. He did not swing a fist. He simply reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder with a hand that looked like iron. The boy froze like a rabbit caught in a trap. "You will apologize," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. The boy tried to pull away, but he could not. His eyes widened with panic. "My pa said," he started. "I do not care what your pa said," Arthur cut in. "I am telling you what is right. Apologize." The boy's mouth worked, then his voice came out small. "Sorry," he mumbled, looking at John like he hated the words. Arthur let him go, and the boy stumbled back, rubbing his shoulder. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Arthur Hayes never got involved in town disputes, not for anyone. Arthur turned to John. "You all right, son?" John nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, sir," he said, like the words meant something deep. Milin led the children away quickly, her heart pounding. They walked back toward the hill with the snow crunching under them, but the warmth of the morning was gone. It felt like they had carried the town's hate home with them. When they reached the cabin, Arthur began hitching the horse to the wagon. His movements were tight and fast, like he had already decided something. Milin stepped onto the porch. "What are you doing?" she asked. Arthur did not look at her. "Leaving," he said. Milin's stomach dropped. "Why?" "I made it worse," Arthur said. "Me being around you puts a target on you. They will make your life hard because of me." Milin walked down into the snow, her boots sinking. "My life was already hard," she said, voice shaking. "They ignored us while we starved. Do you think their silence was kindness?" Arthur's hands paused on the harness. His breath rose in a white cloud. "I cannot protect you from their tongues," he said. "I do not need protection from words," Milin said, stepping closer. "I need a partner. My children need one. They have not smiled like this in months until you came. And her voice broke, I forgot what it felt like to not be alone." Arthur finally turned to her. His eyes looked tired, like loneliness had carved lines into his face. "I am old," he said. "I am set in my ways. I have a ranch and a bad reputation." Milin reached out and took his rough hand. It was cold from the leather straps, but it felt steady. "You have a heart," she said. "And you did not have extra food, you sold something." Arthur looked away, jaw tight. "My pocket watch," he admitted. "My father's gold watch." Milin gasped, the sound sharp in the cold. "Arthur," she whispered. He looked back at her, and his eyes held something raw. "Because I was tired of watching you struggle from a distance," he said. "Because I was lonely. God, I was lonely." Milin squeezed his hand like she could hold him there. "Then do not be lonely anymore," she whispered. Arthur's breath hitched. He stared at her, then the words came out sudden and plain, like a truth he could not keep inside. "Marry me," Arthur said. Milin froze where she stood, snow falling from her lashes, her heart stopping for one hard beat. "What?" she whispered, like she was not sure she heard him right. Milin stood in the snow and stared at Arthur like the world had tilted under her feet. The wind had calmed, but the cold still bit her cheeks, and her tears felt like they might freeze before they could fall. Arthur did not look away. He waited, steady and serious, like he had already chosen his path and would not step off it. "Marry me," he said again, quieter this time, but stronger. "I cannot offer you a fancy life, but I can offer you warmth, food, and a roof that does not leak. I can offer you a man who will stand beside you when people spit their words. And I can be a father to those children if they will have me." Milin's hands trembled around his. Her mind raced away, to the years they struggled together, to the love that had been real, even when life was hard. She felt a sharp pain of guilt, like accepting Arthur would mean forgetting Wei. But when she looked toward the cabin, she saw June and Deo watching from the doorway, their faces tight with fear that this good thing might leave. Anne stood behind them, holding Leanne close. The children had already tasted hope again. Milin could not push them back into darkness. "The town will never accept it," Milin whispered. Her voice cracked on the words. Arthur's mouth tightened, then he gave a small nod like he already knew. "Then we do not live for the town," he said. "We build our own life. Out at my ranch. You, me, and the kids. That is enough." Milin searched his face. She saw no pity there, no hunger for control, no desire to own her. She saw a lonely man offering his whole life like a plain gift. She thought of Wei again, and she felt something settle deep in her chest. Wei had loved her. He would not want her to wither and die in this cabin. He would want the children to be safe. He would want her to live. Milin swallowed, then nodded once, small but sure. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Arthur." Arthur pulled her into his arms. His buffalo coat was rough against her cheek, smelling of wood smoke and winter air. The embrace was not soft, but it was safe. For the first time in a long time, Milin felt the cold stop mattering. The cabin door burst open, and the children tumbled out like they had been holding their breath for days. They had heard everything. "He is staying!" Dao shouted, throwing his arms up. Jun ran down the steps, eyes bright and wet. He did not shout, but his face said more than words could. Leanne ran straight to Arthur and wrapped her arms around his leg. "Papa Arthur," she squealed, like the name had always belonged to him. Arthur looked down at her, and his throat worked like he was trying to swallow a feeling too big for him. He rested his hand on her head, careful and gentle. Then he looked at Milin with a slow, real smile. "Yeah," he said, voice thick. "I am staying." They did not waste time after that. Winter was still heavy and the town was still cruel, but the cabin no longer felt like a trap. Arthur returned to his ranch and came back with a second wagon. He brought more blankets, more wood, and a small iron stove he had stored away. Milin packed what little they owned. She wrapped Wei's carved doll in cloth and tucked it into Leanne's bundle. She took Wei's old coat and folded it with respect. She did not erase him. She carried his memory with her, like a lantern that still mattered. 2 weeks later, Reverend Cole came out to the ranch house parlor to marry them. No one from town came, except the blacksmith, a quiet man who had always nodded at June instead of sneering. Milin did not cry about the empty chairs. She had cried enough in that cabin. This day was not for them. It was for the people who stood in the room. Arthur wore his cleanest shirt and a jacket that looked stiff, like it did not get much use. Milin wore her best silk tunic, faded but neat, her hair pinned back carefully. The children stood close, holding hands. When Reverend Cole spoke the vows, his voice shook a little, and Milin wondered if he felt ashamed for the way his town had treated her. Arthur's voice did not shake. When he promised to care for her and the children, he spoke like he was making a promise to the land itself. After the preacher left, the ranch house felt full in a way it never had before. Arthur's home had been big and silent, built for one man who thought he deserved to be alone. Now it filled with the sounds of footsteps, laughter, and small arguments over who got to feed the chickens. The children explored every corner like they were discovering a new world. Milin opened cupboards and found space, real space, and she felt her shoulders loosen. Spring did come, slowly at first, then suddenly. The snow melted and ran in small streams through the fields. Dark earth showed again. Green pushed up like it had been waiting for permission. Milin planted a new garden near the house, and this time Arthur helped her fence it so the animals could not ruin it. June and Deo learned ranch work the right way, not from fear, but from guidance. Anne learned to cook and sew with Milin, and she began to sing softly while she worked, a sound Milin had not heard from her in a long time. Leanne followed Arthur everywhere, asking endless questions. Arthur answered most of them, even when he pretended he was tired of talking. The town did not change overnight. People still whispered when Milin rode into the settlement with Arthur beside her. Some still stared like she was a problem that should have stayed hidden. But something shifted after that day at church. The same boys who had shoved Jun did not come close again. The men in town learned to watch Arthur's face before they decided what to say, and slowly the children stopped looking down when they walked past people. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and turned the sky orange, Milin stood on the ranch porch beside Arthur. They watched Jun and Dao carry feed to the animals. Anne sat on the steps with Leanne, helping her tie a ribbon around the wooden doll's dress. The air smelled like fresh earth and promise. Arthur slid his arm around Milin's waist, still a little awkward, like he was learning how to belong in a family. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. Milin leaned her head against his shoulder. She looked at her children, full-bellied and laughing. She looked at the land that now felt like home. Then she looked up at the man who had sold his father's watch to bring food to a hungry cabin on Christmas morning. "Not one," she said. They had survived the winter. They had survived hunger and loneliness and the harsh judgment of a town that forgot what kindness meant. And in the middle of the coldest season of their lives, they found something stronger than food. They found family.